Okay, welcome everybody. So this is our presidency chapter. This is chapter 5 in our textbook. And what we're going to go through is not just the commander-in-chief, not just the president themselves, but the executive office, the office of the presidency and all of those different things involved. And I mean, the picture that you're looking at now, this is JFK during the Cuban Missile Crisis. And looking at the Oval Office, the different men that have been through here, the different actions that they have done, and especially looking at the modern presidency, so much of the things that JFK had at his disposal is very different than the original presidents that we had. And so we're going to see a transformation from formal powers to bringing in more informal powers. And we're going to see how, when the executive gains power, how that might relate to the other branches, especially in the Madisonian model, where Congress is supposed to be the most important branch. So going through here, if you are curious, this will help you, I think, for the AP test, and I think it'll help you for the test too. But just it's a short video that introduces you to kind of the nuts and bolts of the executive branch. And if you are so interested, this is a great kind of clip of just like bringing journalists into the Obama White House. And so you can kind of see that even just like a stylistic difference between each president, how they kind of run their show, so to speak. One of my favorite things, as like a huge, West Wing TV show fan, the Obama administration always like had it on the TVs and things like that. Kind of interesting. That's why the Obamas always love a good walk and talk picture that you might also see in Law and Order. So, okay, some fun trivia, I guess. So looking at the Constitution, Article 2, Section 1 outlines the constitutional provisions for becoming president. You have to be 35 years old. The youngest president we have ever had, the youngest in office was 42, was TR when he assumed office after McKinley, but the youngest to ever run and win was JFK. Also need to be a natural born citizen. That means you have to be born in the United States or what is considered American soil, like a military base or something like that. But this individual, Madeleine Albright, who was the Secretary of State under Bill Clinton, she would not be able to run. She was born in Czechoslovakia, so even though as high as Secretary of State, could not run for president. Same thing with like Arnold Schwarzenegger. And then the other thing in the Constitution is you have to have resided in the United States the last 14 years. And if you notice, these are it. This is it. This is all that's in the Constitution as far as running for president. But what we're going to get into is how many informal components of running for president, and then also how the presidency sort of runs, yes, through formal constitutional powers, but so much expansion with what we'll look at as informal powers and even the respective different norms. So running for office, becoming American president, some informal requirements, some trends. Every single president except for one has been white. They've also been male. Okay, we have yet to see the first female commander-in-chief. We've gotten closer, so to speak, as in now we have a female vice president and then also having a female, Nancy Pelosi first, female Speaker of the House, very close in the line of succession. Other informal, not in the constitutional requirements, is being Christian, specifically Protestant. We've only had one Catholic. What's interesting, though, just real quick, I guess is kind of trivia, is the number of people now who are heads of state that are Catholic. So our Chief Justice is Catholic, and Joe Biden is Catholic as well. The other thing, informal, openly heterosexual. We have not had an openly homosexual man or woman be president, like Pete Buttigieg running, but this is another informal, not in the Constitution, but tends to be the norm. And then the other thing that we see is usually there's some sort of political experience. I mean, obviously, Donald Trump is very experienced in the business realm, private sector, but not necessarily a lot of political experience, which is not the norm. Again, another informal thing we could see, not necessarily political experience, but military experience as well. So becoming president, being elected president every 4 years, the term of office is 4 years. That's what's in the Constitution. House is 2 years, Senate is 6 years, a congressional term is 2 years, but the presidential term is 4 years. That's why we always call the 2-year election the midterm, the middle of the presidential term. The only president that really was not elected to office was Gerald Ford, was not vice president in 72. So Nixon won in 72 with Spiro Agnew as his vice president. Then Spiro Agnew had to step down, and then Gerald Ford comes in as vice president. And then eventually will rise to the presidency when Nixon resigns. But everyone else was elected. Okay. Now, in 1951, this is when Truman was president after FDR had been elected to 4 terms. Congress, 2/3 of Congress and 3/4 of the states ratified to make it so the president can only serve 2 terms. If you assume a term, there is still a limit of being elected to 2 terms. There are some kind of loopholes and things like that, but as far as the 2 terms, that's the limit. You need to know the 22nd Amendment. I think my mnemonic that I use is 2. There's 2 terms total, 2 of the 2s. I don't know. Maybe that makes it more confusing. All right. You don't understand, most presidents don't get 2 terms. Most presidents will serve 1 term. At least if you look at the 46 people who have been the president of the United States, most of them have served 1 term. It's actually quite rare, the idea that Bill Clinton and then George Bush and then Barack Obama would all serve consecutive 2 terms. That hasn't happened since Jefferson, Madison, and Monroe. So most presidents serve just 1 term. Okay. Now, what happens if the president during their term does something illegal or happens where they need to be replaced? Well, understand that the line of succession is that the vice president will become president, and there's a couple of ways that can happen. Obviously, if you kick it old school and die in office, that's one way that the vice president become president. If the president resigns their post, which has only happened once with Nixon, or if they are removed from office via the impeachment process, which I will go over. But these are the ways that the vice president would come in. If the vice president cannot come in, then the Speaker of House, and we'll get to the succession later. Okay. But for impeachment means to bring charges against. So to impeach a president means that you think they have done something that is in the under the umbrella of treason, bribery, or other high crimes and misdemeanors. This is what is specified in the Constitution. And the Constitution says if you're going to remove a president, you can't do a recall vote like a governor. You have to do it through the impeachment process. And so it is the role of the House. Remember, the original Constitution, the senators were not chosen by the people. The senators were chosen by the state legislature. So it's the House, the direct lower house, the people, the House of Commons, that gets to impeach the president. So they do an investigation. They bring something against the president. And then they need a 51% vote in the House to impeach. And then the impeachment is tried by the Senate. So in the Senate, the senators serve like a jury. And the Chief Justice will oversee the entire process. Lawyers will speak. You'll have different experts come in and people will testify. And basically the Senate has one of 2 options. They can vote to acquit the president, which means a vote no. We don't want to get rid of the president, don't want to remove the president. Or yes, convict the president, and then they would be removed from office. So in order to do that, they need a 2/3 majority. So to summarize, impeachment is where you bring the charges against. The House will vote, and if they vote by 51%, then the president is impeached. And then the Senate will decide whether or not that impeachment is worthy of the president being removed from office. And if the Senate gets a 2/3 majority to vote yes, convict the president will be removed from office. Now, there are other things that can happen too. If you are convicted, you can be barred from running from public office, but that has to be decided by the Senate. You can be censured, which is kind of like a black mark on your record. You can also lose your presidential pension, Secret Service detail, and things of that nature. Okay, so that's impeachment. So just like looking through the history real quickly here, first impeachment was Andrew Johnson, and so a lot of this was related to kind of scaling back Reconstruction programs and things like that, specifically with the military and the military occupation of the South. And so Johnson was impeached technically for breaking the 10-year oath of office act. He fired the Secretary of Defense when he didn't go through the right processes. But long story short, Johnson was impeached by the House, and then in the Senate they held a trial, and it came down to one senator. There were accusations of bribery and things like that, but basically Johnson was able to stay in office and was acquitted of the charges by one vote, and that was Edmund Ross from Kansas. I mean, my personal opinion was he was so desperate for money. It makes sense that he would be open for that vote. But what's interesting and which I'm learning more about too is JFK wrote the book Profiles of Courage about Edmund Ross, about his courage in voting to acquit President Johnson, but that may not be as historically accurate as JFK made it seem. Okay, so that was the first one. And then nothing until the 90s. And so with Bill Clinton, understand that Bill Clinton didn't get impeached for cheating on his wife or having an affair. That's not illegal. But Bill Clinton told people to lie to the FBI or to ignore the FBI, and he also lied under oath, which is considered perjury. So the House impeaches him, and just like with the Johnson impeachment, it was one party that impeached the president. And then same thing with Bill Clinton. No Democrats voted to impeach Bill Clinton. It was all Republicans. And then in the Senate, Bill Clinton was acquitted of the charges. Didn't get the 2/3 to convict the president, and so got to stay in office. And the sad irony is that Bill Clinton's approval rating went up, and I mean, my personal opinion is it just kind of displays a sort of misogyny that we see in our culture where, it was an issue of Hillary Clinton, which is why Bill Clinton cheated, and even the idea that Americans don't care that much if you cheat on your wife, which is kind of sad, I suppose. Okay. And then 2 impeachments with Donald Trump. The first one in 2000, or I guess early 2020, and then early 2021. Excuse me. But basically, what we're seeing here is potentially a more partisan impeachment. The first one dealing with potentially holding military aid to Ukraine in return for investigating Joe Biden when he was vice president, and then the second one, inciting a riot. And that one, the most recent impeachment of Donald Trump, is actually the most bipartisan impeachment we have ever had. 10 Republicans voted for it. In the past, it's been single parties doing the impeachment, and so the concern becomes with impeachment an actual process in the Constitution to get rid of someone. At what point is it used too politically, more of a partisan issue, and not used actually at the threshold that it was meant for? Okay, lots on impeachment, I know. So what do we do if the president cannot fulfill their oath of office, if they're removed or they resign or they die in office? So what we've seen is almost 10% of our presidents have come through succession. So one, just looking at LBJ here on Air Force One. 3 of our presidents have been impeached, but none were convicted by the Senate. And we do have a pending Senate trial for Donald Trump. But at this point, each president that has been impeached has not been thrown out, meaning they have not been convicted by that 2/3 of the Senate. Now, the other thing that we see, so you need to know 22nd Amendment, presidential term limits. You also need to know 25th Amendment, which deals with succession as well. So when you look at the 25th Amendment, one of it stipulates that if the president is in an unfit state to govern, they will relinquish their powers to the vice president. The vice president will become the acting president. So, for example, the only time the 25th Amendment really has been used is when Ronald Reagan and George H.W. Bush both had procedures where they had to go under anesthetic. And so in that time they were in surgery, they gave the vice president powers. They did that with the 25th Amendment. But 25th Amendment also created, after the death of JFK, and really what do we do if the president is assassinated, or like in the case of Woodrow Wilson, right, having strokes? What do we do in that situation? There's also what we've seen recently is if you would like to remove the president, in addition to impeachment via Congress, the other way to remove a president is with the 25th Amendment. The vice president calls the cabinet together, and if the cabinet can get a 51% vote to remove the president will be removed from power, and then the vice president will become the new president. Like I said, hasn't ever happened. Was created in the context of JFK being assassinated, but could be even a disability and hasn't really been used. 1972. We solidify which person goes through, and we know it goes president to vice president, but solidifying what happens next, especially in going into the Nixon era here. So it goes Speaker of the House, and then the Senate pro tempore, and then Secretary of State, then Secretary of the Treasury, then the Secretary of Defense, then the Attorney General, and then the rest of the cabinet in the order of the departments that they were created in. I would have changed the pictures on this, but it doesn't appear like Joe Biden is having a cabinet going through, but we do seem to have our first black Secretary of Defense. Secretary of Defense is the runs the Pentagon here. Okay, good. So continuing along, let's actually just kind of recap what we've gone over. So formal and informal running for president, you need to know what's in the Constitution, and then you need to know what happens in actuality. Need to know the term of the president. 4-year terms, most presidents do not serve more than one term, and then also need to know that 22nd Amendment. The final thing that we kind of went over is looking at succession. What is the line of succession, and then also knowing that 25th Amendment also. Then what we're going to look at, or now what we're going to look at, is really what are the different powers? What is in the Constitution that give the president the powers that they have? And so I kind of break them down into categories, and the first one being foreign policy. So in Article 2, it talks about the president having the title of Commander-in-Chief of the Armed Forces. They don't even have to have military experience, but every single person who serves as the president is the head of the armed forces. You have the Joint Chiefs of Staff, the head of each branch of military, that will report to the president. And also part of Commander-in-Chief is getting the nuclear codes. It's known as the football. So all of that, is in the Constitution. The other thing that's there is the ability of the president to go abroad and make treaties. So think like the Treaty of Versailles after World War I. Woodrow Wilson goes to France in the Chateau de Versailles and then comes back and presents the treaty to the Senate. It says, hey, Senate, here's what we came up with. And what the Senate does is they do approve by 2/3, but they keep out the part of joining the League of Nations. So point being here that the president makes the treaties and then the Senate ratifies the treaty. And this is also what we're talking about, like with nominating ambassadors, UN delegate here, ambassadors to different countries where the United States has relations. With the ambassador, they need to be approved by the Senate. And so we're seeing a check and balance here. And also notice that it's the Senate specifically that is dealing with this, not the House. And so kind of the extra prestige of the Senate here as well. And then the last thing is also receiving foreign ambassadors, right? And so this is President Abe at Pearl Harbor here. So, foreign diplomats, just kind of meeting and obviously a photo opportunity here. Okay. I believe this was the first time a Japanese head of state had visited Pearl Harbor since the attack. So that, another thing, just receiving foreign diplomats. Okay. So in addition to foreign policy, the president also has certain legislative powers. So these are lawmaking powers and sometimes powers that are dealing with Congress or are in large part related to Congress. So in Article 2, it also says that from time to time, the president needs to provide Congress with a State of the Union address. So it's a speech discussing what is the state, what is the status update. Give us some updates on the condition, the state of our country. And so usually this happens every year, and it is in front of a joint session of Congress. And so you can see the Speaker of the House, the President speaking, and then the President of the Senate, Vice President Mike Pence, sitting there as well. So joint session of Congress. This is in the Constitution. The other thing is that the President can recommend, the President can work with senators, work with members of the House to get legislation on the floor. Oftentimes, the President will have a specific agenda that they would like to pursue. And so when you talk about recommending legislation, they will kind of tell Congress where they want them to go, but ultimately only congressmen can put things on the floor. So limited ability there, but the biggest ability and what the President can use as sort of to their advantage is in the Constitution, the President has to sign the legislation. So Congress will pass a law, but as a check and balance and a check on Congress, the President has to be the one to sign it. So the President will oftentimes use that as leverage, saying, I will not sign this, I will veto it, so change it, or I won't sign it, things of that nature. Okay. The other thing that the President can do is they can call an emergency session of Congress. So think of when the United States was attacked during Pearl Harbor. FDR called an emergency joint session of Congress to tell them to request a declaration of war. Also happened after 9/11. So these types of things Congress can meet in the case of an emergency. Okay. The other thing that the president can do, although it hasn't been used often, is they can adjourn Congress. They can tell Congress to go home. There's some dispute on the legality of this, although it is in the Constitution. This is more what you call a norm. I suppose you could do it, but normally people don't. And a lot of things in the presidency work that way where, yes, I guess you're technically allowed to do that, but based on what previous presidents have done or not done, that's kind of the rules we follow. Think of it almost like unwritten rules of baseball. The big legislative power, other than being able to sign legislation, is being able to veto legislation. And I'll go specifically into the types of vetoes as well. So veto means that you are rejecting the bill that the Congress passed. So my favorite example would be Andrew Johnson. Andrew Johnson became to be known as Andy Veto because he vetoed 14 bills, and each of those 14 bills, many of which like the Freedmen's Bureau and things to help Reconstruction, he vetoed them, and Congress came in and they said, we're going to override the veto. Congress came in by a 2/3 majority, and they passed it anyways. So understand that if a president does provide a veto, they have to tell the public why. They have to tell Congress specifically in an official statement, why are you rejecting this bill? And they have to provide a reason. Even if the president vetoes something, it can be overridden. You only need 51% to pass a bill in the House. You need those 60 votes to end the filibuster, but still only 51% to pass a bill in the Senate. If the president vetoes it, you need 2/3 in the House, 2/3 in the Senate. Okay. The other thing that the president can do, this is kind of like a sneaky type of move, and unofficially. So a pocket veto is not in the Constitution, only a regular standard veto. But a pocket veto is when the president can let a bill die because Congress adjourns. So Congress goes home, and if Congress goes home and is not there, the president can just ignore the bill and wait for the 10 days. Or he would tell Congress to go home during that 10-day period, and basically they would not be present to accept it, and so the bill would die. So pocket veto is kind of like a tricky, like, oh, Congress wasn't there to counteract. It's been 10 days, so the bill dies after 10 days. The 10 days is in the Constitution. Okay. The last one, and this one, I mean, the legality, the constitutionality of the line item veto, as of this point, the line item veto is unconstitutional. And a line item veto is only for budget bills, and it would basically be, we're going to spend this money on 10 things, and they make a list of 10 things. And so the president goes in and says, these are great except for item 2 and item 4 and item 7. I don't like those, get rid of them, and they're just vetoing part of it. The reason why the line item veto has been found unconstitutional is if you get rid of a key component of a bill, doesn't that change the bill itself? And so this is something that has been used like for the mandate component of Obamacare, but the line item veto is technically unconstitutional. The only veto power the president has is, no, I will not vote for it, and then they basically have to tell the public, and it can be overridden by the Congress, although rare. So veto is formal. Pocket veto, line item veto, these are informal. Okay. A couple other powers. It says that when you take the oath, that the president is to take care that the laws be faithfully executed. So understand the role of the president as the chief executive. They are the head. They are the leader of the executive branch. And what is the role of the executive branch? They are to enforce the laws. Okay. So one way in which they enforce the laws is they'll nominate officials in different branches. And so any official that they have, like a cabinet member, ambassador, even people like the White House Chief of Staff, different members in what's called the Plum Book, I'll get to later. It's just a giant book of appointments. Anything the president appoints usually has to have Senate approval. So again, check on the presidency. They also are able to provide appointments during a recess of Congress. So if someone needs to be approved by the Senate, they can technically put someone in, and then once that recess is over, then they can be confirmed. Okay. And then there's other constitutional powers that are more in the realm of the Justice Department. So offering a pardon, a reprieve. You can also like a commutation, so a finishing of your sentence. And this is used by every single president quite often. I suppose the most historic is when President Ford pardoned Nixon for crimes committed. But in general, presidents do use this regardless of the president. And then the other thing that they're able to do in the Constitution is they nominate judges, and then the Senate will confirm those judges. So anything the president appoints, ambassador, secretary, things like that, even a judge, has to be confirmed by the Senate. And so that's the major theme. Notice how we're not seeing the House in here. So most of what the president does, especially abroad, has interactions with Congress. Okay. All that to say, the things I discussed were in the Constitution. However, the presidency today really functions off of the informal powers that the president has. So, first and foremost is the bully pulpit. The bully pulpit is the idea that if you're the president, everyone is going to listen to you. So if you're the president and you want to hold like a White House Oval Office address, the news is going to tune in. People are going to listen to you. And so politicians today using Twitter is really important because it's their ability in kind of the modern world to get out there. Similar with FDR in his fireside chats. And my favorite here, this picture you're looking at is called the Johnson treatment. Andrew Johnson, as Speaker of the House, would really get in people's faces. They say they would talk about his bad breath and really just kind of threatening people. And really, as the president, you need to listen to the president. And from a media standpoint, if the president is speaking, oftentimes it will be covered, and the Americans will listen. But not in the Constitution, right? The other informal power is you're the head of your party, right? So if you're a Republican president, you are the de facto, not officially, but you're the head of the Republican Party. Just like Joe Biden now, as a Democratic president, he is technically the head of the Democratic Party, in all things kind of like a rank and file type of idea. The other thing, and this is what we see really since FDR, is as the head of the executive branch, as the president, it is their job to regulate the economy. And again, this comes from FDR's New Deal, the idea of using executive orders to manage the economy. We are seeing a similar thing with Joe Biden trying to pass coronavirus stimulus, just like President Trump and coronavirus stimulus. This idea of managing the economy, this has largely been left to Congress pre-FDR, but since FDR, we see this huge increase in presidential power, and so regulating the economy since the New Deal has really been the norm, but it is not in the Constitution. The other thing is when you travel abroad, an ambassador of the world, who represents America? What do people in other countries think of when they think of America? Well, they think of the president. And so in that regard, they're unofficially the ambassador to the world. Now these, put a big fat star next to these implied powers. These are things that are very powerful that the president utilizes, and we'll go in more in depth. We'll do an activity with these. But basically, these are the big powers that are used today. They're pretty normal as far as their usage, but they're not in the Constitution. So the first one is an executive order. Hopefully you guys have heard of this. But an executive order is the president will basically create a law, and they'll write it out, and it becomes federal law, similar to if Congress passes a bill. Now, if it has the same effect as a law, why are executive orders potentially concerning? Well, it's going down to a fundamental interpretation of the Constitution. Madison said that the lawmaking, the heavy lifting, that's supposed to be the job of Congress. And so Madison would probably be against this idea that the president could create what's called an executive order, which is essentially an act of Congress created with an informal presidential ability. This is why Republicans are against Barack Obama creating the DACA program. While they may be in favor of the DACA program, although most are not, even if they're in favor of it, it's the president using executive orders to make such a large policy rather than Congress doing the heavy lifting. So that's executive order. Executive agreement is something like the Louisiana Purchase or NAFTA, where it's basically a foreign treaty, but it does not need Senate approval. So an executive agreement is a treaty like the Louisiana Purchase, but the Senate does not need to approve it. Also informal. And then the last one, really we've seen since Richard Nixon, is executive privilege. So the president does not have the same, they have more rights to, I guess, privacy, so to speak. So executive privilege is for specific subpoenas, like a congressional subpoena, the president may not need to comply. It's kind of like an executive privilege is like an immunity, like a protection type of thing. Most famously, so in 1972, you have U.S. v. Nixon, and basically Congress had subpoenaed, the special prosecutor had subpoenaed tapes from Nixon, recordings that Nixon had made of his conversations in the White House being quite paranoid. And Nixon said, no, I don't want to give over the tapes. And the Supreme Court stepped in and they said, well, even though you're claiming you have executive privilege, meaning you don't have to give over the tapes, the Supreme Court said, yes, this privilege exists, but Nixon, you have to give over the tapes. You can't hide behind it. So these three things are very powerful. We will spend more time on them, but not in the Constitution. Okay, that was a lot. Basically breaking this up into two. The president in the nuts and bolts, the terms, the two constitutional amendments, 22 and 25, formal versus informal, running for president, things that we see as norms, and then also the powers. Know the different types of powers. We're going to do a graphic organizer, and then you need to be able to tell the difference between a formal constitutional presidential power and an informal, specifically this slide, and more so these three at the bottom as non-constitutional but very big parts of the U.S. presidency.